I think we can start. It's a full house, which I'm really happy about. Welcome, everyone, to the third event of this spring's After's Translation series at Princeton University, where we host amazing translators of Latin American languages to tell us about their craft, their interest, and to open new questions around the task of the translator. The After Translation series was created as a way to discuss more in depth this interesting moment that we're living in, where while the world moves into English and its monolingualism, its lingua franca condition, we're seeing more and more translators being published and publicly discussed. We're interested in seeing what space translation occupies within and beyond academia, what the creative potentials of it for it are, and what the new boundaries are that can be explored in public conversation. We like to talk about methods, about ideas, and about possible and never absolute theories, about new questions that translation keeps opening for us.
At our last event, we were delighted to host two renowned translators from Portuguese, Julia Sanchez and Daniel Hahn. Both agreed that translating the Brazilian writer Mário de Andrade would be an impossible task. So today, conveniently, we have two people intrigued by the impossibility of this task to tell us a little bit about their journeys and exhilarating discoveries of Mário de Andrade. We're particularly excited to welcome them this month, which coincides with the release of not one, but two fabulous new translations. Flora and Katrina, congratulations. We'll give brief formal introductions. I'll say a little bit about format, and then we'll kick off the event. So starting with Flora.
Flora Thomson-DeVeaux was a translator, writer, and researcher whose translation of the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas by Machado de Assis was acclaimed as a gift to scholars by the New York Times. She studied Spanish and Portuguese at Princeton University and earned a PhD in Portuguese and Brazilian studies from Brown. She lives in Rio de Janeiro and serves as a research director for Radio Novela.
Katrina Dodson is a writer and translator from the Portuguese. She's the translator of The Complete Stories by Clarice Lispector and winner of numerous prizes, including the 2016 Penn Translation Prize. Her writing has appeared in the Paris Review, The Believer, McSweeney's, Triple Canopy, and elsewhere. She holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of California, Berkeley, with a dissertation on Elizabeth Bishop in Brazil, and has taught undergraduate literature and composition courses at UC Berkeley and Bard College. Since 2017, she has taught translation in MFA programs, previously at Mills College and the University of Iowa, and currently at Columbia University. So a brief note on format. We'll have roughly an hour and a half today. We've asked each of our translators to prepare brief remarks of 10, 15, 20 minutes to share a little about themselves, their trajectories as translators, and of course, their two new books. Julia and I will then open with a few guiding questions, after which we'll invite the audience to join in. We hope you'll engage in whatever language you like, English, Portuguese, Spanish, and we hope this will be an exciting event. Before we kick off, we'd like to thank the Brazil Lab for sponsoring this event, along with the program in Translation and Intercultural Communication, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, the program in Latin American Studies, the Humanities Council, and the Graduate School. Thank you to all of our partners for making this event a reality. With that said, we'll turn it over to Katrina and Flora in whatever order you'd like to join. Katrina first?
Us.
Yeah. Flora pointed, so I think Katrina will begin.
Okay, sure. Let me okay. Let's see, how close do I need to get? Hello. Okay. Thank you for having me. It's very exciting to be back here. And as I was telling João and Pedro and some other people, when I was here for the 2019 Amazonian Poetics Conference, that was a real turning point in my translation of Macunaíma, just to meet artists, indigenous artists like Jair Esbel, whose art is on the cover of Macunaíma. It was something we talked about, and he was going to make original art before he passed away in 2021, but I still wanted to include his art on the cover. But meeting Denilson Beniwa and meeting a lot of people who
came from literature studies, but also were doing studies of indigenous art and anthropologists. It just really expanded my ideas of this book, which is a work of literature, but based on anthropological work and natural history. So just wanted to say, it's really special to be here and special to be here with Flora, who lives in Brazil. So yeah, it's great to be just be able to do this. A little bit about my trajectory as a translator. I first visited Brazil in 2002. My boyfriend at the time had a friend named Fabio, who was from São Bernardo do Campo, so where Lula famously also got his political start. So that was the first place, that São Paulo and then São Bernardo do Campo was the first place in Brazil I ever discovered. And then like most gringos, I fell in love with Rio de Janeiro. So we moved back the next year. We were, just kind of out of college and had jobs. We quit, and being an American, you can bring English as your passport to many places. And so I was teaching English in Rio de Janeiro, business English, and then teaching at a private course called Britannia, Curso de Inglês. Yeah, so teaching kids after school and adults at night. And I first read Clarice Lispector during a trip to the Amazon. So I was reading Paixão Segundo GH, one of her most intense books, The Passion According to GH, while in a hammock on a ferry boat from Manaus to Belém on the coast. And so it was a really heady introduction to her work. And then the beginning of 2004, I started taking classes at PUC Rio, which I think you also were at for a little bit. Yeah, so it's the Catholic University in Rio. And so that was my first formal introduction to Brazilian literature. I went there to get a student visa to stay in the country. I'd already finished my undergrad, but I was this aluna extraordinaria, like extraordinary student. And I only wanted to take Portuguese, and they said, no, you've got to take a minimum of 3 classes. So then I kind of just sat in the back of these literature courses very quietly. But, it was the first time I read Machado de Assis, Caio Fernando Abreu, and Macunaíma. That was the first time I read Macunaíma. I still have my notes from that class with Julio Diniz. I actually went back to some of the notes and the handouts from that class while I was translating. So this book has been on my mind for a long time. It was 2004. And then in 2005, I went back to the States and I started a PhD program at UC Berkeley in comparative literature. And so then my knowledge of Portuguese and Brazilian literature deepened. And then in 2009, I was doing research in Brazil, and I went to the Flip, the big literary festival in Paraty, and I met 2 young writers, Emilio Fraia and Vanessa Barbara. And I had met a literary agent. I hadn't thought about the translation, but I met a literary agent here who was looking for scouts for literature. And so I went out to them and said, I'm working for this literary agent. And it was one of the only panels I could get into was their panel about their book, O Verão do Chibo, The Summer of Chibo. And we were about the same age. I really liked their language, and so the use of language in the book. And so I said, hey, maybe I can translate a little bit of your book. And they said, okay, whatever, They were nice about it. And so a little bit later, I actually managed to get a part of it into a journal called 2 Lines, which is a translation journal run by the Center for the Art of Translation in San Francisco. And then they both independently got into the kind of watershed Granta Best of Young Brazilian Novelist issue, which is a kind of showcase of 20 authors. And so because I had translated them, I got into the Granta. And then fast forward to 2012, I was back in Brazil on a Fulbright, and I met Benjamin Moser, who's the translator and of some of the Clarice Lispector and her biographer and the editor of the new Clarice Lispector series of translations from New Directions. And so we met. I thought I could translate some B-sides for a small press, not understanding how translation rights work. And so we kept in touch. He said, okay, I get the sense you do good work. Maybe you can do the children's books or something down the line. And meanwhile, he was one of the judges for Granta. So he did see my work when it came out in translation. And then, many good things in life, it was just this kind of convergence of accidents that happened where Alison Entricken, who's a wonderful translator from Portuguese, she was contracted to do the complete stories. There was something happened where she had to drop out. And so I got the call, and I think, I think Ben thought, well, okay, it's this grad student, and I can kind of like fix up whatever she can't do. But, it became like the most important thing in my life. And so, I was in the middle of working on my dissertation. I stopped teaching. I got a campus job as a graduate student researcher at a humanities center. My job was organizing events and booking hotels for guest speakers and all this. So basically, for 2 years, from 2013 to 2015, I translated the complete stories. That came out in August, and then I filed my dissertation in October of that year. And I'd say, it just totally changed my trajectory, that book coming out. And I probably would have gone on the academic job market, but because a lot of momentum was happening with the book, I just decided to try out translation. And since then, I've been, I've had always a foot in, I don't know if you could call it academia, but I've been teaching this whole time still, but just in a different capacity. I think Flora and I are a really interesting pairing because we both got PhDs in literature, and we both still have a clear commitment to scholarly work if you look at the notes in our translations and our framing, but neither of us ended up as proper academics. So maybe that's something to I one with tenure. I know everyone's always moonlighting, but I think for me, it's interesting to think about. I think in academia, translation does not count as scholarship, in that you can't really get a job through it. It doesn't count toward tenure. So I knew that I wouldn't really have the time. I already was thinking about Makunaima. I had momentum from the Clarissa Spector, and I thought, I'd wanted to teach Makunaima in my undergraduate complet courses, and the other translation is just unusable, as many people know. And I just showed the movie instead. It's a little different from the book, but hey, it's better. So better than the translation. So I thought it was going to take me a year, and then it ended up taking me about 6 years. But I think having a background, so I do think a lot of the work I did from Makunaima, especially, I did archival research and kind of brought together a lot of different sources, because Mariji Andrade himself, was a real scholar, but also self-taught. He did teach at the university in Rio for a little bit. But, when you go to his archives, you just see his piles of notes and his crazy bibliographical organizational system. It's incredible. So I do think that my background as a scholar and a teacher of literature has really informed my choices and approach to translating. So for example, with translating Clarice Lispector, I was really aware of keeping the language as open-ended as possible, because I wanted people to be able to close read it in English, even though there's no substitute for the original. If there was a moment where I found myself kind of closing down meaning because I was taking a really strong sometimes you do have to take a strong interpretive choice, but if there were moments where I could leave something unsaid in a similar way, I would do that. And I do think that comes from my training of just, like reading things very closely. And I think with Makunaima, I was very aware of the book being taught in courses, and there was a kind of tug of war with my publisher over whether the endnotes were going to be included. So I don't have any markings in the book itself, because it's this book that was just written in this kind of 6-day delirium, but then based on years of research. And so it has this kind of frenetic tempo to it, and I didn't want to interrupt it with any notes in the text itself. And I wanted people to have the choice to experience the novel as just this novel where a lot of words are passing over you. A lot of it is written in, it's in this very colloquial Brazilian Portuguese, but mixed with Tupi, the major indigenous language, and other indigenous words, and African words from Kimbundu and Yoruba. So that are, integrated into Brazilian Portuguese. But I wanted people to have this kind of raw experience of the novel, but I really fought to have endnotes and an afterword. There's an introduction by John Keane, who's an amazing writer and translator. But I think for me, I thought, okay, reviewers are going to be really annoyed. And already 2 reviewers have kind of mentioned the 50 pages of notes. I'm like, okay. But but I did it thinking about the long term and thinking, whatever happens to the book now, I know I want teachers and students and people who are interested to have access. And because the book is, based on a lot of indigenous myth and Afro-Brazilian traditions, I wanted it not to just be like a big kind of vague mess in people's heads, but I wanted people to be able to trace some of the sources. So in some ways, kind of read the book against itself, or read the book on a second level where you're kind of seeing past the book itself to its manner of composition. But I do think that is, a lot of in my work, I really am striking a balance, kind of compromising my priorities, coming from a scholarly pedagogical place, and then the practicalities of the publishing industry. Like something in publishing, there's this necessity to have comps. So by which you say, oh, Clarice Lispector is the Brazilian Virginia Woolf, or she's the Brazilian Kafka, or Macunaíma is the Brazilian Ulysses, he's like Rabelais. And coming from the pure space of the university where you're not trying to make money or sell books, that feels like a sellout thing to do. But the truth is, like, you got to kick open the door, with the publishers. And how do you do that? You say, this is how the book's going to sell. So, so let's see. That's, the last thing I'll say before I read a little bit from Macunaíma is just, in terms of my approach and goals as a translator, I'm always drawn to work that's doing something thrilling with language. I think that's like the bottom line is like, does this language thrill me, and does it make me excited to try to do something different with English? Is it pushing the limits of language and how I think I can say things? And of course, the other side of it is that, it has to have something compelling to say and something that's complex enough where I can't ever quite make up my mind about, what it's saying. I still feel with spending so much time with Clarice and with Macunaíma, I still go back and forth over, like the egg and the chicken. What does that mean? And there's so many moments of Macunaíma I still feel that I don't understand. That was partly I translated this book too to just understand it. If I couldn't skip a word, I thought, okay, maybe I'll understand it better. And I think, people have said that the Clarice stories and the Macunaíma are so different, but I'd say that they both have this quality that there's so much joy of language in both of those works. And just, I feel like I've really been expanded by working with them. I think that's but that's why, it's not really, my trajectory is not conventional. If you're a full-time translator, you have to translate 3 or 4 books a year to make a living. You can't, this is slow work. So I think, I'm kind of in a transitional moment, but I think, probably go back to translating books. I think I'm actually pretty fast as a translator, but I just don't realize it. Yeah, but that's why, still, even if you want to stay away from the institution, it is a lot of writers, translators still teach, unless you work for publishing or you have a famous podcast, true crime podcast. Yeah, so that's why, a little bit about me as a translator. And then I'll read some from Macunaíma. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to read just the opening paragraph and then skip to chapter 4, which is called Boyuna Moon, and it's this mashup of different origin tales. So it takes this tale from southern Brazil, from the Guarani. It's an indigenous myth of how Iguaçu Falls came to be, and it's the snake god Mboy got angry, chased these 2 young lovers, and then Mara de Andrade turns the snake god into the Amazonian Boyuna, who comes from the Tupi, and then he uses names and different elements from the Kaxinawa, who are also known as Huni Kunin from Western Brazil. It becomes this origin tale of how the moon came to be that also mixes Piman tales with Kaxinawa and Piman, where the people who were in northern Brazil, where Macunaíma come from. There's some of the people. So he's doing, there's a lot. And everybody knows the first line in Portuguese. No fundo do Mato Virgem nasceu Macunaíma, herói da nossa gente. In the depths of the virgin forest was born Makunaima, hero of our people. He was jet black and sun to fear of the night. There came a moment when the silence grew so great, listening to the murmuring, Hiurariquera, that the native Tapanumas woman birthed an ugly child. That child is the one they called Makunaima. Even as a boy, he did bewildering things. First off, he went more than 6 years without talking. If they coaxed him to talk, he'd holler, "Ah, just so lazy," and not a word more. So that's the opening. And then chapter 4, the hero Makunaima has met his lover C, who, after a very fiery romance, went up to the stars to become a constellation. So she's left him, and he's heartbroken. Next day, bright and early, the hero, aching with longing for C, his lover who was unforgettable forevermore, pierced his lower lip and made the murikita into a tembeta. He felt like he was going to cry. He quickly called for his brothers, bid the Ikameyabas farewell, and took off. They went roaming and ranging through all the forest over which Makunaima now reigned. Everywhere they went, he received tributes and was accompanied all the while by a retinue of red macaws and jandaya parakeets. On bitter nights, he'd climb atop an acai palm, ripe with fruit as purple as his soul, and contemplate the fetching figure of sea up in the heavens. "My she-devil," he'd moan, and oh, how he suffered, oh. And he'd invoke the benevolent gods while chanting canticles that went on and on. "Huda, Huda, thou who makest the rains run dry, send the ocean winds so wild, a-whipping across my land so that the clouds will rush away, and so my she-devil may shine so bright, clear and steady in the sky. Hush all the waters that run throughout the rivers in this land of mine, so that I may splash around, playing with my she-devil in the mirror reflection of the waters." Like that. Then he climbed down and cried his eyes out on Manape's shoulder. Sobbing in sympathy, Jige would light the bonfire so the hero wouldn't feel cold. Manape would choke back his own tears, invoking the Akuchipuru, the Murukututu, the Dukuku, all those lords of sleep and lullabies like this. "Akuchipuru, all and I sound sleep, to Makunaima, who does nothing but weep." He'd pick the hero's tics and soothe him, rocking gently back and forth. The hero would quiet down, and fall fast asleep. The next day, the three ramblers set off once more through those mysterious forests, and Makunaima was followed all the while by that retinue of red macaws and jandaya parakeets. Wandering on, one time as the dawn rays were just scattering the dark of night, they heard in the distance the sorrowful lament of a maiden. They went to have a look-see. Walking a league and a half, they came upon a waterfall, sobbing endlessly. Makunaima asked the waterfall, "What's up?" "The sky." "Come on, tell me." So the waterfall recounted what had befallen her. "Can't you see that my name is Naipi, and I am the daughter of the Tushawa named Meshoichiki, which in my language means big cat crouching. I was the prettiest of maidens, and all the neighboring Tushawas wished to sleep in my hammock and taste of my body, more languid than the flowering in Birosu. Yet whenever one came, I'd bite and kick, eager to test his strength. And none could withstand it, and they go away so mournful. My tribe was enslaved to Kape, the Boyuna water snake, who lived deep in a cavern in the company of Sauva ants. During the season when the ipe trees along the river bloomed yellow with flowers, the Boyuna would come to our taba and choose a virgin girl to sleep with in her underground cave full of skeletons. When my body began weeping blood, pleading for a man's strength to serve, the Swinara owl sang at first light in the Jarina palms of Naitejupar. Kape came and chose me. The ipes along the riverbank were glimmering with yellow, and all their flowers fell upon the sobbing shoulders of the young Titsate, one of my father's warriors. A great sadness had come marching into our taba like a line of sakasaya ants and devoured even the silence. When the wise old page pulled the night back out from its hole, Titsate gathered all the little flowers nearby and brought them to the hammock on my last night of freedom. And then I bit Titsate. Blood gushed from the young man's wounded wrist, but he made no fuss at all, furiously moaning, making love, filling my mouth with flowers so I couldn't bite anymore. Titsate leapt into the hammock and Naipi served Titsate. After we played like crazy, mingling streaming blood with the little ipe flowers, my champion carried me on his shoulders, tossed me into his ipegara moored in a place hidden among the aturias, and sped like an arrow out to the waters of the raging river, fleeing the Boyuna snake. The next day, when the wise old page tucked the night back into its hole, Kape went to fetch me and found the bloody hammock empty. She roared and dashed off to find us. She was coming closer, coming closer. We could hear her roaring close by, closer still, right up close, till finally the waters of the raging river reared up, churning from the boyuna's body. Titsate was so dead tired he could paddle no more, bleeding all the while from the bite on his wrist. That's why we couldn't escape. Kape caught me, spun me round, put me to the egg test. It worked, and the boyuna saw that I had already served Titsate. She was so full of wrath that she wished to put an end to this world. I don't know. She turned me into this rock and hurled Titsate onto the river's shore, transformed into a plant. It's that one over there, down there, right there. He's that ever so lovely floating murure you can see, waving in the water at me. His purple flowers are the drops of blood from the bite, frozen solid by my cold, cold waterfall. Kape dwells down below, always checking to see whether that boy really did play around with me. Indeed, he did, and I'll go on weeping over this rock till the end of what has no end, aching so from never again serving my warrior, Titsate. She stopped. Her tears splashed onto Makunaima's knees, and he shook with sobs. If that boyuna ever showed up, I'd kill her. Right then, a colossal roar was heard, and Kape came surging out the water, and Kape was the boyuna snake. Makunaima thrust out his torso glinting with heroism and charged at the monster. Kape swung her maw wide open, and out came a swarm of apiacas. Makunaima beat them back, defeating those marimbondo wasps. The monster lashed out with her tintinabulating tail, but right there a trakua ant bit the hero's heel. Distracted by the pain, he dropped to a crouch, and the tail flew past him, hitting Kape smack in the face. Then she roared even more and struck at Makunaima's thigh. He simply dodged, grabbed a big sharp rock, and thwop! Knocked that varmint's head clean off. Her body went writhing away on the current, while the head with those big doe eyes came to kiss the feet of its vanquisher in submission. The hero got scared and hightailed it into the woods with his brothers. "Come here, CDD, come here," the head shouted. The three shot away even faster. They ran for a league and a half and looked back. Kape's head kept rolling closer, ever on the lookout for them. So she's chasing. The head is just like rolling, chasing them. They go and they hide in a shack. Then the thwop. Wasn't long before the head showed up. Thwop and knocked. "What do you want? Open the door and let me in." But did the alligator open up? Neither did they. So the head couldn't come in. Makunaima didn't know that the head had become his slave and didn't mean them no harm. The head waited a long time, but seeing how they really weren't going to open up, she mulled over what she wanted to be. If she became water, others would drink her. If she became an ant, they'd squish her. If she became a mosquito, they'd zap her. If she became a train, she'd get derailed. If she became a river, they'd put her on the map. She made up her mind. I'll go be the moon. And so she goes to be the moon.
That was fabulous. I'm sure we have a lot of questions, but we're going to turn it over to Flora, and then we'll go back and do questions after.
I don't know why I pointed to Katrina first. That was my mistake. Try to be quick. I found myself first of all, thank you all so much for the invitation. So lovely to be here with you all, and such a privilege to be here with Katrina. I found myself thinking over, the title of the event, After Translation, what comes after translation. And after translation is where we find ourselves now. In some ways, it's the part I like the least. I'm almost afraid to crack the cover and see what I've done, or to see this other version of myself in print, because there's always a temporality of the publication that you leave that version of yourself behind. And after translation is also when we shift gears and become different people altogether, which is something that I only really discovered after Bras Cubas, what it is to promote a translation, to sell a translation, to comp your author, your irreplaceable, utterly unique author, and finding ways to anchor it in a new context. But before we get to that, I think it makes sense to circle back, because when I came to Princeton as an undergrad, I was very much before translation. I'd never considered translation as a profession. And I remember writing a very snotty essay in high school once about how some poem of Neruda's, in translation, the poetry had been lost and something like that. I've tried to find it since so I could, burn it or something. but instead I'm just doing penance for the rest of my days. So how, if translation wasn't in the cards, how did I come to it? It kind of came to me with a desperate Facebook post. Well, first, I'd learned Spanish in high school, as one does. And I came here. Portuguese was another thing, was not on my map. And I just happened to be at the open house for Spanish and Portuguese, right? It was Spanish and Portuguese. And some very nice people came over with some pamphlets that had butterflies on them. They were very colorful. And they started talking about how easy Portuguese was to learn. See that, be careful with people with colorful pamphlets. They'll sell you all sorts of things. So I started doing Portuguese for Spanish speakers. And to be honest, for the first semester at least, it was really more of a linguistic exercise. And it was in the second semester that it became so much more. So the desperate Facebook post was a friend of a friend putting in her status, help, does anyone speak Portuguese? And, when the call goes out, when the bat signal goes out, even if I just had one semester of advanced Portuguese, I was like, all right, stepping up for duty. What was happening? She had been hired as a research assistant by a woman who's living in Princeton and was going to write a new biography of Carmen Miranda. Carmen Miranda, that name meant nothing to me. Then, as I said, the Chiquita Banana Lady, that sort of, I eased into it. And this woman was writing a new biography, but she didn't speak Portuguese. So she had the issue of not being able to access the biographical materials. And she had hired this friend of a friend to take those biographical materials and type them into Google Translate. This was not something that the friend was doing. This was the agreement. I think it was a real, show of confidence in the powers of artificial intelligence translation, which, as we know today, are still not, all that. And back in 2010, they really left something to be desired. So the friend was saying, help, this doesn't make any sense. I'm spending a whole day, producing gibberish. And I said, I can do better than gibberish, slightly. So I started, if I remember correctly, I started, the first thing I ever translated as a translation was chapter 26 or something of the biography of Rui Castro's biography of Carmen Miranda, which I don't know if you've ever started reading a book with chapter 26. I just had she just gave me like a handout. It wasn't, I didn't have the rest of the book. So that was a first exercise in a challenging translation. Who are these people? What's going on? And I just started having so much fun. It was, I was being paid almost nothing, but it felt like a miracle that I was being paid anything to do this fun thing. And that just became, a big part of my freshman spring was, doing all my homework and then going up to my room with my, my bucket of coffee and entering this world and slowly becoming more comfortable with the Portuguese, with the references, getting to know the people, listening to the music. It was really my passport into Brazil, into Rio, into a Rio that no longer existed, as I am sad to discover to this day. And that was my first project. And the story of that book encapsulates a lot of the joys and the agonies of translation for me because it's still unpublished. So I've since spoken to Rui Castro about this, and he said that when the book was published back in 2004, 2005, some publisher approached him about translating it, and they just had one condition. The book was too big, so they thought it would make sense to publish it without the Brazilian part, which is, if you're familiar with with the book, it's this massive, incredibly entertaining biography of Carmen Miranda. But Rui Castro's great contribution to the Carmen Miranda scholarship was this incredibly thorough documentation of her career in Brazil. She was this person who became this, supersonic star at the dawn of Brazilian radio before being discovered and, going to the U.S. and blowing away the market here. So obviously he spat in their eyes and refused to cut the Brazilian part to publish it. And when I got around to translating the book in 2010, it still hadn't come out. The biography that I was translating for never came out. The production, I later translated the rest of the book for. So I translated like half of the book for the woman who's writing the biography, and then I translated the other half for folks who are going to make a movie about Carmen's life. That didn't come out. And eventually I got around to shopping the whole translation around several years later, and I just kept running into walls. You know, it's too old, it's too big, it's too Brazilian, it's too scholarly, it's not scholarly enough. Just all of the excuses in the book. So, you know, it's just a fact that the book that made me become a translator may never come out in English. So that was my first experience with the world after translation. Translation itself, and especially the process of discovery that it brings, has always been a really, you know, unutterable joy and a privilege. The joy of playing around with words, of being able to see the work as an endlessly fascinating puzzle, and the privilege of establishing such an intimate relationship with it. You know, that thing where you can't skip a word. You know, that bonds you to a work, I think, more than just about anything else. And I always felt privileged, even from the start, to be able to make something of a career out of that playtime. You know, I think, you know, Katrina said we're not proper academics, and perhaps we're not proper translators either, because we don't do anything full time. But, you know, I've always been a translator and a something. So, you know, a translator student, and then a translator and a researcher, a translator and a podcaster is the latest incarnation. But translator is, for some reason, the thing that I feel most comfortable identifying as. I don't know about you, Katrina. Paulina, my wife, always makes fun of me because I have a really hard time calling myself a journalist, even though that's technically what I'm doing, like 75% of my day at Rádio Novelo. But sometimes, you know, for some reason, translator seems to fit better. One thing about the work that I've done as a translator over the past decade is that it's become a little unbalanced in a sense. And I think that says something about the different functions of translation in the system that we're currently operating in, you know, the purposes that it serves. So I've published 9 book-length translations at this point, 7 with academic presses and 2 with Penguin. So, you know, academic translation is a whole other circuit. I had the privilege of translating some really wonderful books, including by Pedro Miramonteiro. But in recent years, a lot of what I translate is even less visible than academic production. It's scripts, subtitles, samples, the kinds of texts that allow Brazilian culture to circulate but don't necessarily become public or public in the same way. And I almost feel something of an obligation to take on that sort of work because I'm so aware of the ways in which English is like the troll under the bridge demanding its payment before a work can cross to the other side, you know, before a film can meet the world, before anything can meet a more global audience. So I've been doing a lot of that over the past decade or so. And my first very visible translation was The Posthumous Memoirs of Brás Cubas, which came out in 2020 and struck a nerve in a way that neither I nor Penguin really anticipated, both with American and Brazilian audiences. To this day, it you know, sold really well. It sold out on the first day, and that became news in Brazil, which made it sell even more. Which, you know, the whole lovely cycle. And to this day, I can't really give a precise accounting of the confluence that led to that. And I can try to break down a few factors if the conversation goes in that direction today. Multiple people asked me, do you think it was your endnotes? To which I say, I don't think so. It's just they're grasping at straws. But I mean, you did get a gift to scholars. I did get a gift to scholars, yeah. I think that was a grudging compliment. Don't but you know, that was that. And after Brás Cubas, I found myself in a position that I'd never considered before, and feeling this tremendous responsibility as I was about to choose this next project. Brás Cubas had been this monument that I almost felt sort of inexorably drawn toward. It was more like it was it picking me than vice versa. That's what I dedicated the space and time of my dissertation to translating. it seemed obvious in a way. It's one of these works that's just, an elephant in the room. And the answer of what to do next was anything but obvious, because the books that began to attract me, the books that I was interested in doing a first translation of, were necessarily more obscure, which did nothing to dissuade me from translating them. But now I was in the position of pitching them as well. Bras Cubas, I just sort of showed up on publishers' doorsteps with a baby in my arms that said, "Would you like to adopt it?" And I was very lucky that Penguin took me on. But my sensibilities as a reader, which are my sensibilities as a translator, are not necessarily the sensibilities of the market, which I knew on some level, but became very clear as I started looking at my little short list through an editor's eyes. I love weird little books, and the market does not always love weird little books. But one of the weird little books that had stuck with me for years was The Apprentice Tourist. I read it for the first time in 2016 when Mario de Andrade was the featured author at that year's Flippi. Flippi is always in these stories somehow. And it made me uncomfortable. I think almost in the same way that it made Mario uncomfortable. Uncomfortable in the sense that he wrote it, that he couldn't bring himself to publish it, and he couldn't bring himself to destroy it. And he destroyed a lot of things. So the fact that he didn't destroy this, I think, says a lot. And I read Turista Aprendiz. I put it on the shelf. But I couldn't really stop thinking about it. There's this peculiar interplay in the book of expectations and disappointment, discovery and obtuseness, and Mario's real stubbornness in moments where he's able to really let go and surrender to rapture. Everything that makes travel an existential challenge, everything that makes our relationship to the Amazon so fraught. It felt that this book had, in a crooked way, captured it in a particular moment of time by a very particular mind. And I felt that much more so about the Amazonian diaries than the Northeastern diaries, which were published together in Brazil under the same title, but have very different characters. Spiritually, the 1927 trip, this one is very different from the 1928 trip, which it was essentially a successful ethnographic expedition. And the 1927 trip is a chronicle of desire and failure and occasional moments of real overpowering beauty. Those are some of the reasons that made me double down on my pitch to Penguin and really insist that this was what I wanted to do next. And I'm fully aware that in the logic of publishing, the fact that Katrina was about to bring out Macunaíma probably weighed much more than anything of the previous things that I said. For the chance to ride Macunaíma's magnificent coattails with my weird little book, I'm extremely grateful.
I think them coming out at the same time, too, it makes it an event.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm still trying to figure out where I go after this, what the after of this translation is going to look like. But until then, I'm enjoying the rest of this journey and still learning to travel along with Mario. So for the reading, I thought I'd pick one whole entry from near the end of the trip that's a beautiful encapsulation of so much that's special about the book, because the real diary-ness of it, with the way that he sort of evolves from an actual diary entry into something that there's sort of an organic theorizing and some really beautiful descriptions, and then the inevitable indignities. So this is July 29th, 1927. Going to Marajó. At 5 and plenty, we take the Ernestina across the bay. Around 8, we get on the Tucunaré, a smaller boat, and go down the Arari River. Long stretches and little stops. Santana, Cachoeira, Paraíso with its buffaloes, São Joaquim with its buffaloes. Only Brazilians would have thought to raise not only zebus, but American buffaloes too, a cross between a sheep and a pig. We're finally in another sort of Amazonian landscape. The Arari started out with a little scrubby forest along its banks and a few incomparably charming cricoids. The ingazeiras blanket the banks, leafy and plump, washing their branches in the river water. A few little monkeys fly from branch to branch. The aningas in bloom. Once in a while, the hoatzins flying low, seeming to weigh a ton. And an abundance of a purple creeper whose name nobody knows, covering the leafy banks. And the view opens up onto new horizons. Immense fields, intense bright green, with islands of forest off in the distance, standing out clearly, a dark green that divides sky from field. Scales thinks of Scotland. I agree eruditely, half ruffled. This is Marajó, folks. Does Scotland have jacanas too, herons? Does it have this Arari River, which never ends and tapers narrower and narrower, leaving voluptuous impressions on your unbridled senses? Does Scotland have this hellscape of big-eared cattle, these zebus and buffaloes degrading the sublime beauty of these fields? Herons, 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 a vividly pink spoonbill in the air. And finally, we go by one perch that wrecks me with feeling. There's no describing it, no imagining it. Thousands of scarlet ibises, pink spoonbills, great white herons, jabirus, maguari storks, white, black, gray in the tall trees, on the bright green grass. And when you make a noise on purpose, a shot in the air, everything flies up in crazy flocks, not fleeing, flying, dancing in the air, reds, pinks, mottled whites, dappled in the bright sun. I fell down onto the deck. People came to see, and it was just that. I fell down. The emotion of it was so powerful that my legs gave out. I fell down. To balance out the poetry of that fall, I remember when I was a boy rooting at football matches at one game between my beloved Paulistano and São Paulo Athletic. When the latter scored the goal that stole the championship cup from me, I fell on the ground then. But now I am a man, hewn by experiences and pleasures, and the birdly beauty of Marajó knocked me down to the ground. The others laugh. Dona Olivia finds my tumble exceptionally funny. But I believe her laughter is a bit forced. She'd like to fall down too, in a fit of happiness like she's never known. Her pretty eyes are exquisite today. Boat bills, maguaris, sunbitterns. Half scarlet ibis, half moorhen. A varnished alligator makes a run for it and flops into the water. A spoonbill in the middle of 1, 2, 3, 13 jabirus. The cormorant, swimming with its whole body in the water, just its slender neck and little head popping up, turns here, turns there, fleeing from us. But the boat is faster, and it takes off in dripping flight to hide itself far away. Malhada is the place where the cattle gather during the day. There's the malhada over there. Sportingly flat fields drained of nature. An oriole blackbird, bright yellow and black, another with a scarlet back, black wings and head. A river turtle on a log, it drops into the water. And off in the distance, the smoke from the bush burning off. Stopped at Tuyuyu, where we'll spend the night. It's unbearable. Billions, billions of mosquitoes. For the first time, I can't resist, and I slather myself with that English ointment made from Java citronella. Nice smelling, by the way. I've got clumps of ointment on my face. But the mosquitoes come doggedly at my face, dig through the grease, bite, and die mired in the ointment. It's horrific. Dinner, eggs, and dried duck. It stinks a bit when it's not well prepared, as was the case here. And we sing. We sing all the same, swallowing mosquitoes.
I guess we'll have questions from the audience, but I have kind of like a theme that I felt that was present in both of your readings is the question of legibility, which I think with Mario Dandaji is always so complicated because he creates neologisms, because he's such a strange character, because as you mentioned, Katrina, he was an autodidact, so his way of conceiving the totalitarian scholarship of the world is completely different to what should be or what is conceived as canonical. So I guess my first question would be, how important was legibility for you guys when translating it? And what did you do with foreign words and neologisms and invented words? How do you balance that? And how much do you care about the reading understanding? Because sometimes with Makunaima, I feel like it's like, oh, maybe I'm not getting this, but I'm enjoying it so much. So yeah, whatever you.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I care about the reader. I think I care more than Mario did. Translators always have to.
Yeah.
Yes, we have to care a little bit more. I actually think this must have been, I mean, we both had challenges, but my first thought was that this must have been harder for Flora because in Makunaima, the whole point one of the themes of the book is untranslatability. So you are, I think someone at the last event, said it's like staging. This book is staging moments of untranslatability, and it's meant to kind of destabilize the idea that Brazil is a monolingual country and that Brazilians should understand all of their own language, which is a language that is a magpie language. So, there's not only Tupi and other indigenous languages and African languages, but there's some, European, not just Portuguese, but there's French, there's Latin. The hero goes to Sao Paulo and learns French and Latin, and even there's a joke about bonde, the tram, the word for tram coming from the English bond. But I think with Macunaíma, there are these really like lexical poems, whole lists. In the section that I read, it's not as much, but there'd be a whole list of different 10 kinds of palm tree and 8 kinds of bird. And so you kind of know from the context what's going on, but also the book itself, it breaks you into this style where there are going to be these whole just kind of agglomerations of flora and fauna that will go over your head in many words. And so I think with the Apprentice Tourist, if you're working with something that is like radically experimental, you can almost create a rhythm, whereas with the Apprentice Tourist, it's not an experimental book. So I think it's more of a dilemma. I was noticing, which words you had translated, like herons or ibises, and then which words you left in the original. And with Macunaíma, I still had this. I kept asking myself how much a reader could take, because in Portuguese, even if a Brazilian doesn't know a word like inajá, or different kind of palm tree, you recognize the sounds because so much of Tupi is integrated. The lingua geral, which was a form of Tupi. And that was the language spoken by the indigenous groups that were dominant up and down the coast when the Portuguese arrived. That was the most, lingua geral based on Tupi was the most, that was basically the colonial national language of Brazil before it was a nation. It was the most spoken language in the country for 200 years, 1500s to 1700s. So Brazilians kind of recognize the words are not as jarring. But I think for me, my solution was to follow Mário de Andrade's lead, in that there's a lot of momentum, of rhythm and sound in the book, and it carries you through. And so, but I would do things like little tags, like I'd say the sabia song thrushes, and then I'd go, sabia sika, sabia poca, sabia gonga, that never shares its food, da-da-da-da. So, there's like enough to hold on to. So, and then the other thing that was helpful was that because I knew I could do the notes, I wanted to do a glossary, but it was just too much. But I was able to just explain a lot of things in the notes so that I could kind of have it both ways. I could have things untranslated, and then I have this ridiculous subsection in the notes. It's like chapter summaries, and then it's so fun though. You could do whatever you want, really. Sometimes I just go selected flora, fauna, and food, because I just decided that I couldn't make it too long, but I just was like, okay, because my editor said, you can't have every single word that you didn't translate in this glossary because the notes are going to be insane. And so I said, okay, I know, but he was right. And so I said, okay, I'm gonna summarize it, and it'll just be this little other stuff section at the end of the main notes. So, so you create your own logics, I guess, and then you just have to have a kind of consistency in that.
Yeah, I think that I don't think that this could get into a championship of a competition of who had the harder time. No, it's obviously a monumental challenge to establish that rhythm with this staging of untranslatability and stage it in a way that isn't completely off-putting, which, again, we have the professional responsibility to care more about the readers than the authors often do, because we are the messengers that get shot on occasion. So we don't have quite the street cred that the originals do. In my case, yeah, I think there are works that are they're very much related, but they have different, they're of different natures, obviously, in fiction, nonfiction. Even though this is a nonfiction book where Mario is constantly inventing, and he'll sort of slip into a more consciously fictional mode, or put on a different voice, or slip into a different character. But yeah, I did feel a stronger impulse toward the documentary realism, to make sure that if people wanted to see the bird that he is talking about, that is exactly that bird, and not making up necessarily. I went through a phase of making up common names that didn't exist in English, and then I thought this might, this might confuse people. Yeah, I mean,
but sometimes they work poetically. I got Alison Entrigan is doing that in her translation of Grandes Sertão Veredas, the real Ulysses of Brazil.
Yeah, the real Ulysses.
And actually I did a workshop with her, and I was like, oh, you're just making stuff up. Oh, because like sometimes it's like a colorful name. You're like, oh, that kind of sounds good in English. So sometimes it kind of works.
Yeah, no, I liked them. I just thought, the first allegiance of this book is to,
it's nonfiction.
Yeah, it's nonfiction.
Yeah,
that exactly. Yeah. No, if I could bring myself to put it on the fiction shelf, but I saw it in the wild at Katrina's suggestion. We did a lot of bookstore hopping and seeing it there in the travel section. I was like, oh, yeah, I'm glad that I went for.
Oh, it's in the travel section.
It's in the travel section, which is we can.
Well, that's another selling point. It's like everyone who goes to the Amazon is going to have to read this book.
Yeah, this is lots of practical tips. The Java citronella paste doesn't work. I think we invent our own forms of legibility for each work. But I did it's very much a hybrid. So I did feel the conflicting poles of wanting to make it sound as good as possible, but also making it as true to the things that I could establish that he saw and experienced and ate and all that.
I have so many questions, but I'm going to limit myself to just two. So thank you so much for sharing and reading. I want to think about that notion of untranslatability, because I think some translators will talk about it as that can't be translated, or another definition could be that which could be translated in so many different ways that it's impossible to come to a definitive version. So I'm wondering how you think about your translations sort of over time. Do you see it as being, a definitive Macunaíma in a sense, or a definitive apprentice tourist? How will it change over time? Is there sort of an infinity of possibilities for these texts, or is it more limited? And then the other question I had, going back to, thank you, Flora, for sort of invoking the title of the talk after translation. One of the things that readers often can't see in the book is how much embodied experience goes into the translation. So both of you have written a little bit about your experiences traveling to the Amazon. And I wonder if you could just say a brief bit about that. What was it like to go on that journey quite physically, right, in a way that we can't necessarily see, but maybe hear and feel in other ways in the book?
The pointing, it works. No, I don't think I don't think any translation that I've ever done has been definitive, even for myself, as evidenced by the jarring experience of opening my own translations and thinking, this Thomson-DeVeaux translation was really outdated. We need a new Thomson-DeVeaux translation. But the timing of that, I mean, there you can think about it sort of theoretically, poetically, and also in terms of the market. What is the degree of the market's patience and desire for more versions of the same work, which is, it was a huge surprise that I was able to find a home for what was then the fourth translation of Posthumous Memoirs of Brás Cubas. How I have this anecdotal sense that with works of Latin American literature, people see them in a sort of more workman-like way, that if there's an existing translation, then it's probably good enough, and it doesn't necessarily deserve one every generation like the great, Russian or French classics. And whatever we can do to help dispel that impression and have a new version for every generation. Everything shifts. Entropy is too strong, I think, for there to be a definitive translation of just about anything. And I don't know if you want to address the first point, and then we go to the second question.
Go to the Amazon,
sure.
Yeah. I feel the same way, that there will probably be another Clarice translation in my lifetime. Macunaíma, all of Mário de Andrade's work is in public domain. And I said to someone, oh yeah, I welcome many, other translations of Macunaíma. I was like, be my guest, no one's going to do it. And it turns out, if you go on Amazon, somebody has published a translation of Macunaíma in March. This tiny press, some mysterious man named Carl Engel, who, as far as I can tell, translated a book maybe from Russian or from German and is a lawyer somewhere. And I'm like, who did this? So in theory, I want many Macunaímas, but the month before mine comes out, I'm like infuriated. I looked at the Amazon preview and I was like satisfied that it was actually like pretty all right, but then some of the things, like some of the notes were off and some of the, just like different choices. I was like, no, I think mine's still better.
Yeah, no, there was a self-published posthumous memoirs that came out at the same time.
Oh, really?
And it got
and the other one.
And the other, but the self-published one was the real issue because people bought it and then complained about it, and then they took it off Amazon, and then they merged the reviews.
No.
And I had to fix it, Penguin. Yeah. They fixed it. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that it's, pedagogically, it is such a great thing when you're teaching a work of literature to compare different translations.
Yeah.
The students love it. Suddenly they have something to say because it's very concrete. And before they know it, they're doing literary analysis and interpretation because each translation's a different interpretation. And it can really illuminate a lot about the style of the original and the potential meanings. So, what was the other? The other thing I was going to say is that, I think we have it a little bit easy in this sense as translators of Brazilian literature, is that there's not that much in the historical canon that people are attached to. You're not retranslating the Russians. There's no Constance Garnett of Brazilian literature. You're not retranslating, like Sappho or all the Flaubert. So in some ways, I knew that people would just be grateful to have a different translation than the E.A. Goodland version that translates "Ai que preguiça," just so lazy, is like what an effing life. So it's just, so I mean, that's a little, it's easier. You want to talk about the Amazon?
Yeah. I also went to the Amazon before starting translation in 2018. Pauline, I also had the experience of the slow boat between cities, which is a thing that only the tourists do because it's the point of to go between the big cities on the boat, because the point of the boat, as I realized when it started stopping all the time, often at 2 a.m. This is the only route for so many tiny communities along the riverbanks. And this was, I was completely ignorant of this until I was, we're stopping someplace at 2:30 in the morning and someone's coming on and asking if I want to buy cheese and things like that. And that was, it was one of the most remarkable trips. We were just in Pará, so Santarém to Belém, and the temporality of that boat and of the Amazon and of the side channels. There was a point at which there had been some pirate attacks, which didn't seem like something that should be happening in this century. But there were, the captain took a side route, and all of a sudden we looked on the map and we were technically like moving through the middle of the earth. It was not, sort of there was this sense of, a really placid, slow moving landscape, and at the same time a sense of here be dragons, literally uncharted territory. On a more prosaic note, if I could eat food from Pará for every single meal, that would be fine with me. That was a preference that was established on that trip, and I sort of clung to the sensory memories of that week or so when I was translating The Apprentice Tourist, and I think a part of what made me gravitate towards this weird little book as opposed to other weird little books was the chance to mentally travel with Mario at a point when I was very much stuck at home. And as I was finishing it up, Paulinha was invited to give a podcast workshop in São Gabriel da Cachoeira, which is the far western Amazon. And I said, "Oh, go, have fun. I can't. I have to revise this translation." And she said, "What are you saying? You have to come." She was obviously correct. And And I tried to, Katrina, at that point we were already talking, and Katrina had a little remaining laundry list of, can you ask people what this thing is? Just in case someone up in São Gabriel da Cachoeira knows what this is. So I went around with, I had my little list and had Katrina's little list, and people were like, what are you talking about? Never heard of that. But being able to see the upper Rio Negro, which is a part of the Amazon that Mario never made it to, was incredibly stunning, and definitely the preface was written under the influence of the Rio Negro, and just a completely different part of the Amazon. And since then, I'm able to go to Alta Floresta and see the Amazon from the other side as well. So I'm nibbling away at the edges, and I know that I have a very, very long ways to go with the Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Mario wrote Macunaíma before he ever went to the Amazon, and then he went to the Amazon, and then he revised it. And when you look at his revisions of the book, so the book came out in 1928, and then he had all of these handwritten revisions for the next version, the 1934 version, which is actually the one that we read today, and that I translated from many different versions. The most recent, but I looked back historically at these other versions, but I could see that he was adding to his list of flora and fauna, and and different words and different things that he kind of discovered in the Amazon and got excited about. And I think for me, that was when I was researching the book. I got a travel grant from the Brazilian National Library. And so I took part of that grant and I went to the Amazon. I had been years earlier, and I went to Ilha do Marajó, and I saw those buffalo, and they really are kind of shocking, the American buffalo.
What the hell is this? Yeah.
But that time, I went to Manaus, and then this kind of like eco lodge outside of Manaus, and we did these tours in boats and just hiking through the forest. And I had my little notebook of the words I didn't know and pestering the guides. And I remember kind of sitting in the boat with one of the guides, and was just going down my list, and then I get to Mandacaru, and I have no idea. This is cactus he just says Nordeste, and it's like from the northeast, and so I hadn't even realized that Marujin Draghi had dropped this cactus that is a symbol of the dry, arid northeast into the middle of the rainforest, and so it helped me understand kind of his process. And then there was, he said he wanted to desgeograficar, which it's interesting because you translate it as degeographize or something. And I changed it to deregionalize because I couldn't stand the sound. Degeograph. I was just like, no, I'm not going to do it. But, he wanted to kind of like deregionalize Brazil and just toss things into the wrong biomes. But, I would see things like the Inajá palm tree is the tallest. It just goes straight up. Taller than anything else in the canopy. And when the hero gets to São Paulo, he starts seeing the buildings in terms of big palm trees, and he sees Inajá palms with smoke plumes. And I think the other thing is just the book is so much about linguistic, but also natural abundance. There's just this profusion of flora and fauna, and then in the city, in São Paulo, like objects and people and machines. And I think I really... both the times I went to the Amazon, I was just so struck by how loud the forest is and just teeming with so much life. Like you really feel it. And so there's this word in the book, kiriri, which if you look in the Huais or dictionaries now, it's a kind of bird. It's actually the name of an indigenous group. But in earlier specialized dictionaries, I think it comes from Tupi. It's the word for the silence of the nocturnal forest. Because it's never totally silent. It just gets quieter. And so it's kind of, so it was something I was like, oh yeah, I've experienced that.
That's beautiful. I think we'll open it up at this point and we'll have questions from the audience. Would anybody like to jump in? Maybe I can bring the mic to you.
Thank you so much for you guys who organized this, and thank you, Katrina and Flora. It's wonderful to have you back here. I have a question for both, actually. Katrina, you mentioned how important it was. The symposium, the meeting here that we had in 2019, and the fact that you met Jai, Deresbel, and Denilson Baniwa. I wonder, how the indigenous turn that somehow we are all going through really changed the course of your translation, because you mentioned it. I mean, how concretely, how would you say this happened? Also, I was curious. I mean, you used this idea of joy of language, which with which is I agree, and it's so clear in Mario's writing and in your translation and in Flora's translation. And your decision to sing the song, I mean, right now, I wanted to know more about it. And Flora, in kind of in the same way, I wonder if the fact that the Mario that we're talking about now is different from the Mario we were talking. I mean, you were both mentioning generational new translations. I mean, the fact that we now can say with and no one will look at us, that Mario was gay, was black, and it was not fine to say that he was queer and black at the time of his life. Does it change anything? I mean, is this somehow a queer translation of a queer Mario? Would you say that? Thank you.
I know there's a lot in that. Maybe I'll answer half of it and then go to Flora, and there's more to say. I did think about the singing. I wasn't sure if I was going to sing. I could feel my face getting red. But I did translate the songs I did make melodies for almost all the songs in the book because I wanted them to work as songs. And actually, they're more ba-dum, 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 ba-dum than I would have translated poetry. And Mario was an ethnomusicologist and a musician. And so, I mean, music was so important for him, and a lot of his work that he was doing, collecting different folk songs, is in the book. It came out the same year as Ensaio sobre a Música Brasileira, Essay on Brazilian Music. And so, it was my way of kind of testing the songs, and I think it's like how I read it in my head, I sing the songs. And so I actually have pitched New Directions to do the audiobook. And I think if I can do it, I'm like, I'm going to have to take some voice lessons. Just to so it's not all like child's shaky voice. I listen to a lot of American folk, so it's like, it's different. I mean, the Aku Chipuru is a little bit different, but that other song, it's like I'm listening to the Carter Family and thinking about, there's one song that's like, oh, Susanna, oh, don't you cry for me, but my secret version. So, so it's definitely thinking of kind of, because Mario was kind of like a Alan Lomax figure, collecting, I think it was between Zora Neale Hurston and Alan Lomax, collecting all of this music and folklore. And then the other question about the indigenous turn, in Brazil, there's been so much more interest in indigenous art and culture, and it's great to see people like Denilson Baniwa kind of taking over these major museums and doing programming. And I think for me, I was always interested in the sources. And I have to say that the place I had to do the most original research was the Afro-Brazilian sources of the book, in the Macumba chapter that's based on Candomblé. And Macumba was the name of Candomblé in Rio. Now it's a pejorative term, but I think that's still a big gap in the major sources in Macunaíma, which are more focused on indigenous. And so I had to kind of look at other sources. But I think with the indigenous content, I think just meeting, for me, it was so important to talk to indigenous artists and people, who are just working with living indigenous communities, so that for me, it, wasn't just a book. It wasn't just research I was doing, and it really made me think more concretely about how does this book hit different people? Because, it's a complicated book, and I don't agree with everything in the book, but I think it's also holding up a mirror to Brazilian society. But I think I was really afraid. I was on a panel with Jair Esbel, who called himself the grandson of Macunaíma, the original Piman deity, or demigod, and I was just like, oh no, I'm so, Jair's gonna hate me. Why are you translating this horrible book? But it was just so interesting to see that he had a much more complex view of the book, where he was critical of it in certain ways, but also said Mario was an artist, and we steal different things, and in a way, he has this essay that he says, Jair has this essay where he talks to the original Macunaíma and says, why did you let them steal your story? Why did you let them steal your image? And he says, well, I'm the one that wanted to be on the cover of the book. I wanted to be there, and this is how we're going to get out to more people and live for eternity. And, so I think for me, it just was very special to think about how this book, again, if you have it without the notes, it's just this kind of like mishmash of like, oh, it's all this Brazilian stuff. Okay, big mixed race country. But if you have the notes in it, then you can say, oh, I want to know, these are the name of the people, this is the name of the tradition. You can track those things down, and actually it's a vehicle for learning more about these really, vibrant cultures. So.
Did I queer Mario? Yeah, that work was already done. No, but I'm thinking about how I approach this both consciously and unconsciously, because as I said, the book is a lot of it is about desire and frustrated desire, which is an old classic in the homosexual canon. And I think that probably not through any merit or fault of my own, the theme, the sort of subplots of frustrated desire, which, knowing who Mario is, you read in a very different light. There's there's not much you can do with the unsaid as a translator, and much is unsaid, but the tantalizing things that are said, I think, shine differently today than certainly a century ago. And that goes for both his racial identity and his sexual identity. Because as he moves through the Amazon as a mixed-race man from São Paulo, he's constantly read as, he's foreign. It's clear that he's foreign, that he's not a Brazilian, which is, a first shock to the system. But whether people identify him as Portuguese, as German, as Italian, and then there's this incident where they cross over the border and everyone writes down some sort of identification, and everyone else goes for, their São Paulo or Rio Grande do Sul or, Switzerland, and he's the only person who writes down Brazilian. So there's an attempt at retaining a Brazilianness, at retaining a sense of belonging, which is constantly challenged by everyone's perceptions of him. And I think that interplay between self-identification and how you're seen by others and the uncomfortable misfits that can arise in that exercise. I think that it's all over the book. And I'm not sure how consciously I played that up, but it's definitely, I think it's a big part of what made the book stick with me for these many years.
Yeah, just a small thing. Yeah, I think it's going to be so interesting to read these two books together. And I think with Macunaíma, to me, there's so much gender confusion, sexual confusion, racial kind of like on the spectrum, confusion. Like he's from an ambiguously Black indigenous tribe, and then turns white, like blonde, blue-eyed white at one point, and then one bathing in a magic fountain, and then one brother turns quote unquote red, and the other remains Black. And I think that's coming from the Brazilian folktale, the three races of Brazil, the three races. But I think, to me, this book could have only been written by somebody who was continually having those categories challenged. I think that this is, for me, like as a mixed race person, I think that is like one of my ways in. I don't know what it's like to be a mixed race Black man. I don't know what it's like to be, queer Brazilian, but I do know what it's like to be mixed race and, have one parent not from here and have people constantly ask you, like, what are you, or tell you what you are based on how they see you. And I think that I think it's so easy to think of this book as just kind of like a farce, but I do feel this undercurrent of, a bit of like bitterness, but also just this questioning of fixed boundaries, in terms of these identities. And so that to me, it's like it couldn't have been written by somebody who had a more uncontested identity. Yeah.
Just one more thing about the indigenous turn in The Apprentice Tourist. I think the folks at Penguin got very excited about it being, this writer's encounter with indigenous peoples and how it changed him. And it's mostly...
Right, he's not the virtuous author that you want.
He's not the virtuous author that you want. I mean, he wanted to encounter tribes. He was systematically foiled in that from almost the whole trip because he was traveling in the entourage of the coffee queen, Olivia Penteado, who had set up this journey. Mario thought it was just going to be this freewheeling, we stop and we go in the jungle and we see things and then we get inspired. And no, at every stop they had the official speeches, and then you meet the mayor, and then you see the school, and then you see the church, and then there's a dinner, and then he has to make the same toast every time. And so that was part of what kept him from having that encounter. But it didn't keep him from imagining the encounter. And he doesn't I mean, some of the encounters that he imagines are more evidently farcical, but I think one of the ways in which the book is still very much alive is that he's speaking from this parodic position of someone, I went to the Amazon and I saw these things, which is everyone who goes to the Amazon lies. That's a tradition. You have to make something up. And Mario he puts his anthropologist hat on, and he makes up all these stories about all these fantastical tribes that he met. And when I was at USP at a lunch, I was there consulting the papers, the originals of The Apprentice Tourist, and I was talking about one of these tribes, and the person was like, "Oh, really? Is that? I haven't heard of that one." But obviously, sort of embarrassed not to have heard of this people and their strange ways, and was like, no, he was joking. So the state of ignorance that that the world, but even Brazil, even people in neighboring states live in as to the lives and customs of these many indigenous peoples, that's very much still in play.
I guess we have time for one more question.
Somebody else. I was going to ask something along the lines of what Pedro asked, but your answers has been just amazing. I was just also taken by starting with Katrina when you said about this thrilling experience with language that both of you had with the authors, but also this leaving it unsaid and open and being drawn into that, and at the same time feeling that's unfinished, you could return to it later, it's incomplete, and you are transformed, as Flora said, by this process. It was very striking to hear that. And I think the question that I had, which follows on Pedro's question, what you were saying, how do you, because you had the question, where would you put this in the bookstore, right? So, okay. But where would you ideally place this text in conversations that are happening in academia or in the broader public? Where do you think those texts fit? We know that they might not fit immediately because they're Brazilian, early 20th century. There are, other authors now being read or the conversations. But where do you, because you were drawn probably by something that you felt that they could contribute to some kind of discussion and conversation. And then the other question I had to do with like the difficult moments in the translation, like the ethically charged moments, where you face something, like Katrina said, I don't agree with everything, where you face something that you would write differently, or you would not want to be associated with that kind of thought. How do you deal with that, and like ethically yourself as a translator?
I think I have to remember that I didn't write the book. I did choose to translate it, but I'm not going to censor anything. I think sometimes, with when words never match up exactly. So I think sometimes if there is a pretty strong or hurtful word, and you can choose to go to the stronger word or the more the less hurtful word, there's something like I would go on the lighter sense of things, but there were things, I think it's like it wasn't lost on me that there are, one of the themes in the book is xenophobia. They say to Macunaíma, like, go take a bath, and he says, oh, that's what Brazilians say to, immigrants. And then, there were ethnic slurs for Polish people, for Portuguese people, for Hungarian people, and that you could find these, kind of equivalents. And at one point, there's some, I think, Yeah, there's some, I mean, I think that the book is actually, like, it steers clear of the worst or the crassest language because it's kind of childish. But I think for me, I just have to translate it as it is. But for example, I have a friend who's translating a Greek young adult novel that's a little bit dated, and there's some racist language in that book, and she's choosing not to translate that because it is for a young adult audience. So I think, but because this book is a more scholarly book, I'm not, but there's a lot of euphemism in the book itself, but, when there are moments, there's like sexual violence against women, that's cartoonish, or just gender violence, but some of that actually does, I mean, this doesn't, it's not it doesn't make it okay, but it comes, when I was reading the indigenous tales, a lot of actually the kind of worst moments, or the moments I thought were kind of most controversial in the book, came from folk tales and myths and riddles, common Brazilian riddles. So, yeah, and I think in terms of where the text fits in the general discussion, I mean, I think this will be a great addition to, Latin American literature classes and discussions of modernism. But also, it's such a book of the Americas, and I think it's, a book to talk about these uneasy collisions that happen, under one flag, one nation. It's a national book, but not a nationalist book. But, there's so, when you talk about these countries where you have, just this violent history of colonialism and slavery and indigenous genocide and dispossession and wave after wave of immigration. I mean, I think people here will recognize, even if it's such a different world, they'll recognize a lot of these tensions that are at the heart of this book as well. So, but honestly, I don't know. I mean, Pedro was quoted in the New York Times article on Makunaim on Friday that came out online on Friday. This book is always on the verge of being canceled. So. But I mean, I think there'll be hard conversations, but I think I want this book to be out there for people to begin to have a conversation about it. So.
Yeah, as you read translations, I have there's a whole subgenre that is the apologetical footnote, saying the author had some views that. And I don't think any of my footnotes are apologetic, but I'd have to check. No, I mean, there was a lot of, when you read it and then you read it again, you kind of hope that he's going to do something different at some points. Please, let's just get it right this time. No, and I think that it makes sense coming from a more scholarly pedigree just to have this sense of warts and all, you can't understand the work without these objectionable, more challenging elements. And again, trying to not worsen anything in translation or to make it more objectionable, certainly out of context, because, we're talking about a century's difference. So slurs evolve at lightning speed. As for where it fits in the conversation, I think, wherever Macunaíma goes, the apprentice tourist should go as a sort of, as a companion piece and as a window into his process. Because one of the things that really fascinated me from the start, I've been drawn to works that dance on the line between fiction and nonfiction, and this is sort of a fiction in elaboration, but trapped in a nonfiction. It's a daydream, it's a travelogue, it's a pre-novel, it's really gendered, genre fluid, and it could be in the travel section. I would really be curious to hear from someone who reads it as preparation for their trip to the Amazon. I can start slipping my business card into copies in the bookstore. If you go to the Amazon after reading this, please give me a call. I didn't know where I was going to find it. I would have thought, memoir in a sense makes maybe a little more sense. But I'm not mad about travel. I think that's it's a fine home.
With that, we are running out of time, so maybe we'll just thank everybody again for coming and give another round of applause for Katrina and Flora.